All right, hello, uh, Communication 2 class. This video has been a long time coming because originally it was canceled because I was sick about a month ago. Um, but this cold, this lingering infection in my sinus has never really gone away. So I'm gonna try not to cough too much. But to be honest, I went to the clinic this afternoon and there were 45 people. It's Sunday, of course, so I had to go to a 24-hour clinic. But there was a lot of people there, so be careful. A lot of people are getting colds and some people are getting pneumonia. Turns out I'm not one of those people, fortunately. But if you're sick, make sure you document it, and we have our last class tomorrow. So this has to be done. Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. So that's my preface to today's lecture. It probably won't be as long as it should be, just because of my situation with my throat and my nose. Chapter 9 is a very, very general topic. The title is, What Have You Been Doing? So as usual, I'm going to modify it a little bit from what is in the textbook. But the first thing it starts talking about is how the average American person spends their time. And I should add that to my list here. If you can modify time using different verbs, spending being another one. Obviously, American culture being the largest economy in the world, and how American culture has developed. We've talked about this both in this class and my British and American culture class, how capitalism is sort of intertwined with the language. We're going to talk about sports metaphors too next week, because sports and entertainment is very it's an essential part of American culture. And so to explain things, they use a lot of metaphors using money, and they use a lot of metaphors using sports. So not surprisingly, you can spend time the same way you can spend money, meaning I think it disappears. You can easily spend, unless you're one of these ultra billionaires like Elon Musk, you can't absorb all this spending that you do. So you can easily spend time, as with money, it can disappear and then you have nothing left. So there's an expression, you probably know it. If you don't, it's very, very well known amongst English-speaking people in various countries. Time flies. The full expression is like an arrow. Time flies like an arrow. But most people usually just say time flies, which means before you know it, you've grown up and you're old, and you it seems like time has passed very quickly, just like an arrow flies through the air and hits the target. Before you know it, you're an old person and you're looking back at what happened, and a lot of it you can't remember because it passed so quickly, and because you can't remember everything that has happened. So I'm gonna alter the title somewhat, and we're gonna call it time management. How do you use your time? In other words, wasting time. We're all familiar with that. It's wasting time means just throwing it away because you're not really valuing the time that you have. I don't think this is a very good attitude, but when I was younger, I did it just like you do. And I still do it. You know, you're waiting for something, especially if you're waiting for something, anticipating something better, even, if it's 15 minutes later or an hour later, sometimes you just do nothing and you just wait for the time to pass. Another way of wasting time, of course, is being not non-productive, right? This is a sort of I guess it's a mature way of looking at it. Since you're in university, you should be in the library studying, but instead you go to the PC Bang and you play League of Legends, or what's the other one that you guys play so much? Overwatch. I too am guilty of doing that, and I have played Overwatch and League of Legends, for the record, but you know what I mean. It's not wasting time, I think, if you are productive all day and then you reward yourself by playing a computer game. But if you play computer games all day instead of doing something that you should be doing, then you're wasting your time. That's my opinion. You can express yourself how you want to in the interview. You can make a counter argument if you like. Passing time, though, we have an expression, a pastime. A pastime is a general, usually when we talk about hobbies, sometimes I talk to students and they say, oh, my hobby is watching TV. And I say, well, that's really stretching the definition of a hobby. The same way we stretch the definition of sports, for example. To be honest, if you consider, let's say pool, Koreans usually call it pocketball. If you consider billiards a sport, you're kind of stretching the definition of a sport, because there's not a lot of athleticism involved in that. Or you talk about esports, which are computer games. They're competitive, but is it a sport? I personally, I'm gonna weigh in on the side of it's not. Darts is the same thing. When a person is not fit, they're not in shape, and they can be the world champion, I think that means that it's not really a sport in the strict sense. So, similarly, a hobby has to be something that develops a skill, or creates something, or is a type of learning or something like that. So reading a book, like reading, I don't know, the complete works of Charles Dickens, anybody who said that they did that, I would say your hobby is reading and you've read everything Charles Dickens has written. I would say, yes, that's a hobby. But if you said every night you watch YouTube for 2 hours, random stuff, which doesn't really seem to have any value or doesn't increase your knowledge or your skill base or anything like that, then I would say this is passing time. It's still something you're doing to pass the time. It's entertaining, but it's not something productive or something that helps you develop. So that's the difference between a hobby and a pastime. This is, I'll just put it in the lowercase because that's the way it should be. A pastime is something that makes time go faster, but doesn't necessarily, develop a skill or add to your knowledge or your ability. Okay, so there's a distinction there that I often make, because I think most people, if you told them that your hobby was watching TV, they would probably not comment, but they would probably think to themselves that that's not really a hobby. If your hobby is fixing cars, or your hobby is making ships in a bottle, or collecting stamps, or reading Charles Dickens, then you're fitting the definition better. Killing time, I think there's no ambiguity there, and ambiguity means there's no. It's clear. It's clear that killing time just means you want the time to go away, usually because whatever the time that you have is not, you don't consider it valuable. I think a good example would be, for me, I could give you an example of being in the hospital. I once was in the hospital for a week. That's the longest I've ever been in the hospital. I think that's the only time I've been in the hospital overnight. But I ruptured my Achilles tendon, which is the tendon in your foot, which is named after the hero Achilles, right? It's the biggest tendon in your body. And I snapped my Achilles tendon when I was 29 or something. And so it had to be reattached. It's a major surgery. And you just have to lay in the bed for a week, and the doctor has to check your progress. And you have to wear a cast for 3 months. It is a terrible experience. But the worst part is laying in the hospital, having nothing to do. And literally, you're just trying to get rid of that time in the hospital so you can get out of the hospital and get back to your normal life. I was killing time in any way possible. I had a laptop, so I spent a lot of time watching. Some of the television shows I watched were great. I watched The Wire and The Pacific, and a bunch of HBO stuff, which was good entertainment. But I was literally trying to get rid of the time, and that is the definition of killing time. Spending time is a more flexible expression because, of course, you can spend money wisely. You can get more things from your money, or you can get less. So you can throw your money away and buy something really expensive that you don't use, or you can be very careful and save your money and buy something that's essential. So spending time is something that you can use in a positive or negative sense. Okay, now this is not very much of what I've said is actually in the textbook. So the textbook is useful, and it does talk about how the average American, watches as much TV as they sleep, pretty much. Like, we're talking like 6 hours of TV a day kind of thing. So America is the great television nation, and I guess that's not surprising because they invented the television, and they made programs for the people that bought those televisions. So they're the pioneers of the idiot box. I think that's what you say in Korean. We usually say like the boob tube or something, which that means the television doesn't make you smarter. It makes you less smart, which is a tragedy because Mr. Farnsworth, the person who invented the television, thought that television would make people smarter and that it would actually broadcast things like war and scientific inventions, and it would be the great education tool of the future. And it turned out in many ways to provide a platform for people to create things that were not very educational. I'm sure he would roll over in his grave if he saw what was going on the internet these days. So it does talk about a lot about time passing. The grammatical stuff is really useful. All of us, including me, native speakers also have grammar issues. So the present perfect continuous is a very useful tense. So on page 105, for example, it talks about a Saturday afternoon. What are you doing? How long have you been doing it? Right, that's a typical question. So you have to be able to manage, understand that and be able to respond in the right tense, right? So the answer to that question is, I'm shopping at the mall. I've been shopping for 3 hours, right? So this is the classic until now situation. Sometimes my students just use the present continuous and then add until now. It really has the same effect, but that's what the present perfect continuous is for. It is to express something that you've been doing. It started in the past and it's continued until the present, right? That's why it's called the present perfect continuous. So for example, I've been walking for 20 minutes. I've been walking since 11 o'clock. You can say a length of time, or you can say the starting point. Either way, that works. Okay, so there's a lot of examples of that for you to practice. I know some of you do practice, and some of you don't. as I mentioned before, all of the MP3s are available because most of you do not have CD players anymore. So I made the MP3s available on the Cyber Lecture website, so you can listen. One of the articles is called "Wasting Time," and the songs are pretty bad. I'll be honest, but at least amateurs got a chance to have their minute of fame, I suppose, and get recorded. But passing the time is the song that is included, so you can look at the questions, right, and come up with your own. When I ask you, how you manage your time, or give me an example of how you spend your time, that's the type of question I'm going to ask you on the exam. You should be able to handle that. Explain a situation, just like I did about a hospital, or you anticipating a big event, or you procrastinating, delaying something you should do for your homework. Whatever it is, just make sure you try and use the correct expressions and demonstrate your fluency through vocabulary, and try to make as few grammatical mistakes as possible. Okay, and chapter 10. So far I haven't coughed. That's good. This sort of overlaps a little bit, and I think this is good that two of the topics do overlap a little bit. We had the space chapter, right? Space travel was chapter 8, and going to the frontier, the edge of the Earth, the Marianas Trench, Antarctica, the Moon, Mars, or whatever. All those things, those are great adventures, right? This is the title of chapter 10. So it's unlikely, to be honest, that I will ask you both questions. I won't ask you chapter 8 and chapter 10 because they intersect. So it's the same thing with an interview that you have with Korean Air to be a flight attendant, or KAIST down the road, to be an administrator or something. They have a pool of questions that they're going to ask you, especially if it's an English interview. Okay, this is mostly for my Korean students, but if you're from France, or you're from Germany, or you're from Uzbekistan, the same applies. If you're going into an interview and it's primarily geared towards your language ability, rather than like actually trying to test, your ability to improvise or check your personality, or see if your resume is full of lies and fake references. This is the purpose of an interview. You want to know if it's an interview in a native or first language case. You're trying to find out more about the person, to check who they really are, right? To sort of get a deeper sense beyond what their resume or their application reveals. But if you are doing this because you have to demonstrate your English ability, so you might have two interviews, one in Korean and one in English, or one in Chinese and one in English, or one in Uzbek and one, something like that. If this is the case, that you're doing a second interview to test your English ability, then really the best thing for you to do is to sort of not try and memorize or cover every possible question, but to group the questions together, right? If questions that are related to your personality or your experience, or your habits, or let's say they ask you a question like pertaining to the job, then some of these questions are all, you can have the same answer for 3 or 4 or 5 different questions. They're just phrased differently. So rather than trying to prepare 200 answers for 200 questions, you might be able to prepare something like 30 or 40 answers for 200 questions because a lot of them overlap. This is what I'm trying to say. So Great Adventures and The Final Frontier, or going to space. Going to space is a great adventure. So if I ask you to tell me about a great adventure and you decide to say going to the moon is a great adventure, I can't argue with you that that's not the acceptable answer. But anyway, alternatively, you can have specific answers for specific topics. And I would like to distinguish between, because some people might talk about space, like one of our students did a presentation on space. That's not an adventure, that's an explanation or an example of what it's like to live in space, what it's like to be an astronaut. That would not be able to answer this question. Instead, you might talk about, excuse me, there's my cough. You might talk about a real person like Marco Polo, who was one of the, not the first person to go from Europe to Asia, certainly, but one of the first people to document it. And he's famous because we have a book, right? We have a book talking about how he lived in China for several decades, and he came back, and we got all this information about Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and many things stemmed from that. So, and he wasn't sure. I think he wasn't sure if he was ever going to get home, right? That's part of the adventure. What makes something an adventure? Well, it's something it's something extraordinary, right? It's something that most people don't do. At least a great adventure is something extraordinary, right? If it's something you do every day, then it's not an adventure. So there's got to be some risk, some danger, right, involved in it. And there has to be something new, right? If it's not new to everyone, then at least it's new to you. For Marco Polo, when he arrived back in Italy, and people read about his experience, that was new to everyone. Nobody knew anything about the Yuan dynasty in China. So his experience in his book, was an automatic bestseller because people could experience something they'd never experienced before, and they didn't have to deal with the risk or the danger like he did. But he did. Eventually, he was allowed to come back, and so the rest is history, right? Indiana Jones is not a real person. Indiana Jones was played by an actor named Harrison Ford. If you don't know, that's fine. But he's sort of a, what can I say? He's a good example of a Hollywood adventure. It's a good example of a Hollywood adventure movie. That, we have different categories: fantasy, action, science fiction, superhero movies. Indiana Jones was like an archaeologist, and he went into the jungle and the desert, and he found ancient artifacts, and he had a hat and a whip and some leather boots and stuff, and he was handsome and charismatic, and he hates snakes. There's a sort of a whole there was a whole sort of category that was created by those movies, in the same way that Star Wars, and actually Harrison Ford played Han Solo in Star Wars, the original Star Wars series. It sort of spawned its own universe because it was so popular. I've only seen the first 3, but I think there's 5 Indiana Jones. It's sort of like the Terminator movies. They just never end. But anyway, Indiana Jones, if you wanted to talk about a movie where there was some sort of great exploration or adventurous protagonist, that would be fine too. Sir Francis Drake, I guess this is just a shout out to my British and American culture class, because people usually talk about Ferdinand Magellan, who was, he technically wasn't the first person to circumnavigate the globe, because he died in the Philippines, if we want to be sticklers for the exact truth. But anyway, his ship, Ferdinand Magellan, went around South America and crossed the Pacific and arrived in the Philippines, and he died there. But his ship made it all the way back to Spain. He was a Portuguese navigator, and rightfully he gets credit for the first ship to travel around the world. But Sir Francis Drake was the first captain to actually survive. He did it about 100 years later. He was English. He's a much more interesting character, I think, personally, just because he was a privateer. He was a soldier, a sailor in Queen Elizabeth's navy. He fought against the Spanish Armada. He went around the world. He crossed the Panama, where the Panama Canal is in Central America, to see the Pacific Ocean. He stole lots of gold and silver. He was a slave trader. He was almost caught by the Spanish numerous times, and he eventually died fighting, in one of his adventures. But his life and the life of his cousin, John Hawkins, is something out of, a storybook. It doesn't even sound like it's real. It's one of those things that it sounds like Robinson Crusoe, which Robinson Crusoe is a good example of a great adventure, but Robinson Crusoe is fictitious. He's not a real person. So Robinson Crusoe would be a good example too. But he was the creation of Willem Dafoe, and but a lot of people read Robinson Crusoe at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, and they thought Robinson Crusoe was a real person. That he had, been marooned on a desert island and lived there for a while, and then made his way back to England and told the story. But it wasn't. It was a work of fiction, biographical fiction, I guess you could call it. But anyway, one of the great works of English fiction, Robinson Crusoe would be a good example. Sir Francis Drake was a real person. You could talk about him. You can talk about somebody from your own country, of course. Talk about a Chinese person, or a French. Jacques Cartier is a famous explorer who basically discovered Canada. I remember that from my high school days. Sieur de La Salle is a French explorer who discovered the Mississippi Valley. Is already discovered, of course, by native people thousands of years before that, but Columbus, the list goes on. There's a lot of examples in the textbook too. Dr. Livingstone is one of the examples in the textbook. I remember Dr. Livingstone because Sesame Street, which is an American educational television show, they had a short scene with a bunch of characters searching in the jungle, asking everybody they saw, are you Dr. Livingstone? Because he was one of the people who penetrated the jungle, searching for the source of the Nile River, which is the longest river in the world, and in Central Africa, the farthest parts of Africa from the coastline were still undiscovered. 100 years ago, people were still finding, still mapping and looking at different African territories. So Dr. Livingstone is an example that is given in the textbook too. Now, if you like, of course, there's always, with all of these adventures and explorations, individually they don't look like that they have a negative effect on human culture or human history, but globalization is a perfect example. We benefit from so many different things, economically and culturally, exchanging things all over the world, but there's a very uneven exchange that's involved in globalization, and part of this is related to these adventures. Like, we consider them adventures, but in the end, some of these things, like Dr. Livingstone penetrating Africa, or Marco Polo visiting the what we call the Orient, the Asian continent, some of these things ultimately ended up in exploitation and war and unbalanced, relationships between people. So you're welcome, if you like, to take that perspective and explain to me how some of these great adventures are inaccurate, or they have some flaws, or they have some negative perspectives sort of baked into them. Sir Francis Drake is a perfect example. He made a lot of money exploiting the slave trade. He was one of the major pioneers of the English involvement of the triangle trade, of capturing or trading for human beings in West Africa and transporting them to the New World, and benefiting financially from selling human beings, which is, there's no way to sugarcoat the fact that that's a crime against humanity. You can't bring people and sell them into indefinite servitude and pretend that there's not a moral dark side to that. So Francis Drake, as interesting as his story is, he definitely has there is definitely a lot of criticism to be leveled, rightly so, against him. Indiana Jones fights against Nazis all the time. Germany is distanced itself very well. I think my German students don't particularly love the fact that Nazis are still an enemy in Hollywood movies after I think Germany has, in the last 75 years, sort of paid proper respect to the people that it has, at least it is done its best to reconcile its history, unlike many other countries. Let's be honest, Canada included, which I'm from. We have our own things. If you're going to talk about the development of Canada and the great explorers in Canada, then you have to address the issues with taking native territory and exploiting their weaknesses because of the transmission of diseases and so on. So it's a complicated thing. You can deal with it from your own perspective. I'm not going to be judgmental. Transportation has changed. Now we're doing spaceship, but if you go back in time, you can talk about ships, you can talk about traveling on land. It's your choice. Sometimes these are called excursions. This is more like just traveling rather than trying to find something new, or having some sort of purpose, like Columbus trying to reach India in order to get spices and silk and pottery and so on. It's not an economic expedition. It's more of a attempt to push the boundaries of something, more like going to Antarctica and going to the North Pole or something like that. So you make your own choices about the topics, as usual, as long as it fits the broad sort of umbrella of great adventures or of time management, then that's fine. Okay, and that's where I'll stop. Hopefully the medicine takes effect by tomorrow, and at least I don't have to talk very much because the last round of presentations are happening tomorrow. So thank you for listening to the lecture, and good luck on your presentations and the exam. I'll see you tomorrow, and the final exam is a week from Monday. Have a good weekend. Have a good Sunday evening.